Hello, this is Lafayette Faust. A few weeks back, I was fortunate enough to be a guest on the Cryptids of the Corn podcast. Justin and Jay are the hosts, and they discuss all things cryptid, such as Bigfoot and dogmen, as well as the occasional paranormal entity. They allowed me and my art director Chris Goins to come on the show and discuss our paranormal experiences. They were gracious in allowing us to promote Nevermore Hollows and Black Sheep Studios. As a way of saying thank you to Justin and Jay, I wrote them into the Nevermore Hollows universe. When I asked them what beast they'd like their characters to battle, without hesitation they said, Snallygaster. Well, I had no idea what the heck a Snallygaster was, but after doing research, it became clear that this is a monster that seems custom-made for Nevermore Hollows. So, with all this being said, I hope that you give their podcast a listen. As for Justin and Jay, I hope you enjoy the adventure I put you two into. So, with that being said, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. Elmer Fitzdale had been a local character, in his 50s, who was prone to tell wild stories to the kids about the monsters that lived in the woods. He was considered a kook because most of the townsfolk did not believe in such things, but he was loved by all who knew him. Alyssa Hart and Sheriff Cotton Mosley were genuinely saddened at the sight of his dead body, which lay in a field across from the Pink Flamingos trailer park. Elmer's head had been crushed. His torso was ripped open and all his organs removed. His right leg had been severed at the knee. His left arm was missing, and his body was completely drained of blood. Mosley grimaced. He looked away from the body and surveyed the field, which was awash in golden morning sunshine. I've seen some pretty nasty stuff in my career as a soldier and an officer of the law, but this is pretty much at the top of the list of disgusting. Alyssa served as the town's coroner and medical examiner. She was 50, with red hair and kind eyes. She, too, was accustomed to gruesome scenes, and she was also moved by the condition of Elmer's body. So, who found him? Nobody, Mosley grunted. Mrs. Gilmer, who lives in the trailer closest to the road, she heard him screaming about an hour ago and called it in. I sent a deputy over to talk to her to try to get more information. So, what are you seeing here? Alyssa knelt for closer inspection of the body. The head seems to have been crushed, not bashed. The stomach is sliced open, not ripped. Look at the wound on his knee. It's as if his leg was pinched off. Same with his missing arm. Mosley was a man of average height, but the confidence with which he carried himself made him seem taller and more imposing. He tilted back his Stetson and glanced across the field to the forest. So, you think this was a person that did this? No, Alyssa said. While the wounds seemed deliberate and clean, I don't think it was another human that did this. Okay, it's not human, but too clean a kill for a wild animal, Cotton said. You're thinking something paranormal. Alyssa glanced up at Cotton and nodded. Yeah, that's my guess. Damn, Cotton growled. Most of the townsfolk were in the dark about Nevermore's secret war against the paranormal. He wanted to let everyone know, but he was afraid of what would happen if the truth got out. He wasn't worried about what the townsfolk would do. He trusted most of them. He was more concerned about the various secret government entities that would swoop down on them. His years as a soldier had taught him to not trust big government. But he also knew that the creatures that had taken up the residence in the area were more of a threat than any human could be. He made it his mission to kill every monster he could before the body count got too high. Elissa carefully leaned over Elmer's body. "Look at these marks on the skin around his stomach." Cotton knelt beside her so he could get a better look. The flesh was peeled back, exposing the cavity, which was missing all the internal organs. But on the skin around the gaping wound were small circular bruises. "What do you make of them?" he said. Elissa took a moment to consider her answer. "They look like they were made by the suckers on the tentacles of an octopus or a squid." Cotton nodded thoughtfully. "I see what you mean. And if you look at how they're spread out across what's left of his torso, you can see that there's a clear pattern." Elissa saw it now that she too had accepted the premise for what they might be. "Yeah, it looks as if 2 tentacles were wrapped around his right ribs, the other 2 around his left. I bet they were used to pull him close, then something sharp sliced open his stomach and scraped out his organs." They both stood and looked around the field. "You're saying we're dealing with an octopus or a squid?" Mosley said. "I know we're in a coastal town, but the ocean is 10 miles to the east of us. There's no way a squid or an octopus made it this far." Elissa shrugged. "We've seen some crazy creatures over the years, Cotton. Why would this case be any different?" Cotton grunted. "This shit just keeps getting stranger. Should we call Tiberius in on this one?" Tiberius Poe was a local detective who specialized in cases that science and logic could not explain. Before she could answer in the affirmative, the deputy who had been interviewing Mrs. Gilmer arrived on the scene. She parked at the edge of the field, got out of the cruiser, and headed their way. Her name was Levita Rose. She was a 30-year-old black woman who knew about the town's secret. She was pretty, even in uniform, with dark skin and a bright smile. She was respected by the other deputies, and Cotton trusted her. She walked up, careful not to contaminate the scene. She curled up her nose at the sight of Elmer's corpse. "Ugh, that's terrible." "What did you find out?" Cotton asked. Levita shook her head. "Not much. Mrs. Gilmer says she heard Elmer screaming, and she also heard what she described as the sound of an eagle, like when it calls out. I interviewed a couple other folks, but one said that the sound was more like a giant snake. The other said it was more like the growl of a mountain lion." Cotton looked at Elissa. "What do you make of that?" Elissa shrugged. "I don't know. I'll get Elmer back to the lab and perform an autopsy on what's left of him and see if I can get anything further." 2 hours later, Elissa had Elmer's ravaged corpse on her autopsy table. Just as she was about to begin, there was a knock at the door. She turned to see her stepbrother, Chris Gowan, standing in the doorway. Behind him were 2 other men. One was a big guy, clearly could handle himself, with a mop of hair and wearing glasses. The other was smaller and wiry. He also looked as if he could take care of business. But she was surprised to see that he was wearing a straw hat that seemed to be covered in tinfoil. "Not sure you want to come in here," Elissa said. "It's pretty gruesome." Chris had been a deputy back in Tennessee before moving to Nevermore Hollows. He'd seen his share of gruesome. He glanced back at the 2 men behind him, then back at Elissa. "We can handle it. These guys can help." Alyssa shrugged. "All right, come on in, but I warned you." Chris and the two men stepped inside the autopsy room. It had not changed much since it had been built back in the early 1950s. It had green tile on the floor that also ran halfway up the wall. The stainless steel and porcelain autopsy table sat in the center of the room, with a bright lamp attached to a movable arm dangling from the ceiling. Chris motioned toward the larger man. Alyssa couldn't tell if he was in his late 20s or his early 30s. "This is Justin," Chris said. He then nodded to the wiry man, who seemed to be the same age as Justin. "And this is Jay." Alyssa shook their hands. "So, how do you think you can help?" Justin grimaced at Elmer's corpse. "Well, we can tell you what did this." Alyssa's hazel eyes glimmered with wonder. She had not expected this response. "How so?" Jay snarled his nose at the corpse. "Yeah, man, that's nasty." Justin ignored Jay and said, "We're investigators of sorts." Alyssa's interest was piqued. She knew that if Chris had brought them to her, they must have flexible minds. "Good. Are you guys paranormal investigators?" Jay pulled his gaze from the body. "Kind of." "What does that mean exactly?" she replied. "What is your background so that I can understand better how you can help me?" Jay glanced at Justin as if to say, "You want me to say it?" Justin shrugged, clearly saying, "Sure, why not?" Jay gave a wry smile. "We have a podcast." Of all the responses that Alyssa expected, this was not one of them. "A podcast," she said. "Yeah, we hunt cryptids," Justin said. Alyssa had an open mind. She was not one of those people who believed you had to have formal education in certain fields to be competent. She knew that modern formal education was averse to open-mindedness and outside-the-box thinking and clung to rigid dogma as much as any religious cult. The result was that new ideas were stifled and progress slowed. So, she accepted that the two young guys standing before her, one wearing a hat lined with tinfoil, the other wearing a t-shirt that said, "Bigfoot is my gateway drug," were as capable at helping her solve the mystery to whatever monster had killed poor Elmer as any university-trained scientist would be. "Okay, I buy it. What is the name of your podcast?" she asked. Justin smirked. "Cryptids of the Corn." "I love it," Alyssa said. "Is that a play on Children of the Corn?" Jay shrugged. "Kinda, but more so that where we live, there's a crap ton of cornfields." Alyssa chuckled. "Fair enough. So, gentlemen, have you ever seen a dead body?" Justin and Jay exchanged a curious look. Then they both said, "Not really, at least not like this." Alyssa felt that maybe they weren't being completely truthful, but she also felt as if she could trust them. So, she motioned for them to step closer to the autopsy table. She flipped on the overhead light and pulled it over the body so they could see better. Justin leaned over the torso. "The flesh on each side of this gaping wound, you see what I'm seeing, Jay?" Jay nodded. "Yeah, tentacles." "Correct," Justin said. "And from the throat down to the groin looks sliced, not ripped or chewed." Jay again nodded. "Yeah, something sharp did that and ate all his organs." "His skull is crushed," Justin said. "Looks like by powerful hands." "Seems obvious to me," Jay replied. He snarled his nose at Elmer's milky dead eyes that had bulged from their sockets. Justin maneuvered around the table to get a better look at Elmer's leg. This is a clean slice right below the knee. Probably the same thing used to slice open his stomach, Jay said. Justin brushed back strands of his curly hair from his eyes. Yeah, the same with his missing arm, clean slice at the shoulder. Yep, and all of his blood was completely drained, Jay replied. Alyssa watched their interaction during the examination of the corpse with a wry smile. They were methodical, yet it lacked the dry medical or stuffy scientific feel. Instead, the whole scene was respectful, but quirky. So, what are we dealing with here? She asked. She couldn't help herself and playfully said, An octopus with a machete? Both men leaned close over the body, giving it a final look. Then they straightened, and at the same time they said, Snallygaster. Alyssa had come to realize that the monster realm was immensely diverse. There were your classic werewolves and vampires and witches, but she had also personally performed autopsies on snake people whose hearts grew eyes and legs and had chased her around the lab. She had seen a creature that was part human, part toad, that ripped the heads off its victims and turned them into gruesome jack-o'-lanterns. She had seen demon-possessed pigs and fought monsters that were literally so undefinable that she simply called them nubs. But upon hearing what Justin and Jay told her, she could only say, What the hell is a snallygaster? You want me to take this one, Jay? Justin said. Sure, Jay replied. Justin cleared his throat. A snallygaster is part lizard, part bird. It has very sharp beak and tentacles that protrude from its mouth. Alyssa tried to picture what this would look like in her head, but couldn't quite make it out. Chris handed her his phone. Here you go. I drew a picture of one and saved it on my phone. Alyssa took his phone and looked at the creature. It looked exactly how Justin and Jay had described it. It had the body of a large lizard and 2 large feathery wings on its back. It had a razor-sharp beak and 4 tentacles writhing from its mouth. How does it eat with those tentacles in its mouth like that? She asked. Nobody knows for sure, Chris said. There seems to be more lore than real sightings, but we think that the tentacles retract into the throat so that it can use its beak, and its throat must be structured in a way that it keeps the esophagus clear so that it can swallow its prey. Alyssa hated that a man had lost his life, but she felt intellectual excitement well up inside her at the idea of such a strange creature. Chris has probably already told you that he and I are putting together a database on all the monsters and strange beasts that inhabit Nevermore Hollows. We're calling it a survival guide to Nevermore Hollows, Chris said. We're waging war here in Nevermore, and not just against cryptids like this snallygaster, but against beings from the spirit realm, and they're all evil. Alyssa nodded. All right, boys, you're the pros. How do we kill this thing? Justin shrugged. Don't know. Yeah, Jay said. There's been sightings throughout history, but as far as we can tell, nobody ever killed one, at least not on record. Gotcha, Alyssa said. It looks like we will be the first to kill one then. Where do we start our search for it? The lore is that they prefer deep forests and mountains, Justin said. Chris grunted thoughtfully. Well, Nevermore is surrounded on 3 sides by Dunwich Forest, which is some of the deepest, darkest forests in the world, but there's hundreds of thousands of acres, so where do we begin? I say we start looking in the forest closest to where the body was found, Jay said. All right, that sounds good to me, Alyssa replied. It was late afternoon when they got back to the field where they had found Elmer's body. Alyssa drove them all in her 66 VW bus. On the way, Justin and Jay told Alyssa more about their podcast and shared their deep knowledge of cryptids. She parked at the edge of the field beside a Dodge Ram. "Oh, Lord," she said, "this guy's a yahoo. He sees himself as a warrior, though he didn't make it through basic training as a Marine. He's a hothead who's always trying to start some drama." They got out of the van and walked toward a man in his 30s who was dressed in camouflage and loading a rifle. He had a scraggly beard, and his every movement revealed his conviction that he was the alpha male. "Carl," Alyssa said, "what are you doing here?" Carl took a long moment to size everyone up. He then glared at Jay's tinfoil hat. As Alyssa expected, he finally decided that he was far manlier than Justin, Jay, and Chris, then smirked at Alyssa. "I'm here to kill the sumbitch that got Elmer." Chris knew that Carl's redneck bravado was going to go sideways if they weren't careful. "What do you think it was that killed him?" he asked. "What I done heard was that he was messed up pretty bad," Carl said. He spat a stream of black juice from the tobacco in his cheek. "Some asshole done knifed him up at a bar last night, then dumped his ass here. Then a bear ate him up after that." Justin and Jay were amazed at how far off from the truth Carl was. "Yeah, that ain't even close to the facts," Jay said. Carl nodded at Justin. "Why the hell you bring a spear to hunt a bear?" Justin held up a large wooden spear with a sharp tip. "This isn't just any kind of spear. It's a Bigfoot spear." Jay held up a massive claw that appeared to have been cut from some animal. It was tied to a short handle with the claws flared out. "And I brought my wampus cat claw." Before Carl could make a belittling remark, Alyssa said, "I'm here on official business. We're looking for anything further that can shed some light on what happened to Elmer. It would be best if you just leave and let us do our job." Carl stood straighter. He was tall, and it was clear that he was used to people mistaking his height and his redneck bravado for might and righteousness. "You do what you feel you need to do, Missy. I'm going to track down that bear, kill it, and then I'm going to find the asshole who knifed up Elmer, and then I'm going to make him pay." Before Alyssa could object, Carl slung his rifle over his shoulder and strode off into the field. Alyssa exchanged a frustrated glance with Chris, Justin, and Jay. Then they collectively decided to follow Carl, not because he was worthy of their trust, but because they knew they'd likely have to save the idiot's life. Carl glanced over his shoulder, saw them following, and stood even straighter, his steps becoming more of a march, as if he were leading a platoon of soldiers into battle. When they were about 30 yards from the tree line, Chris noticed an unusual feather sticking up from the grass. "I've never seen a feather that large before," he said, pointing. "Could that be from the snallygaster?" They stepped closer and noticed that the feather was about 2 feet long and glimmered black and brown and green with flecks of red. Carl strode a few yards further, then turned and gave them a frustrated look. "It's a bear we're looking for, not some damn bird. Let's go. I want to bag this bastard before it gets dark." Ignoring Carl, Alyssa said, "This would be perfect camouflage in the forests around here. This thing could be nearly invisible while inside the forest." Justin pointed to a thorn bush just inside the tree line. "There's another feather over there. I think it's from the snallygaster. It seems like we're on the right path." Carl gave them his best General Patton grimace. "Of course we're on the right path. I know what I'm doing. Come on." He turned and strode off into the forest. In addition to the spear and the claw, Justin and Jay both carried sidearms. Chris had a shotgun slung over his shoulder and a machete in a sheath on his belt. And Alyssa had a rifle. Justin and Jay took the lead with Alyssa behind them and Chris bringing up the rear, and they followed Carl into the forest. The bright afternoon sun was dramatically dampened by the towering trees. It seemed as if twilight had fallen upon them. They stopped for a moment to let their eyes adjust to the gloom. "This thing's going to be difficult to spot," Jay said. They moved further into the woods. They heard the calls and songs of various birds and the rustle of what they hoped were squirrels in the trees. 20 minutes passed with no sign of the snallygaster. Then, just when Chris was about to suggest they change their heading, he spotted another feather on the ground in a shaft of light. Justin plucked the feather from the ground and glanced around. He was about to speak when something fell from the trees above and landed in front of them. "Shit!" Chris said, as everyone jumped back from the massive body that lay at their feet. It was covered in thick black fur. "What is that?" Alyssa asked. "It's a black bear," Carl said. He tried to hide the shaking in his voice by speaking louder and with more authority. "Or what's left of it. It's missing its head and both its hind legs, and all its organs are gone. What the hell could do that to a bear that size?" From above them came a soul-slicing hiss that ended in a rumbling, chittering growl. They all looked up to see the snallygaster sitting on a thick branch that snaked above them. The beast was easily 10 feet long from head to writhing tail. "What the hell is that thing?" Carl said, his voice now shrill with fear. He dropped his gun and turned to run. The snallygaster raised its head and gave a loud cry that was a terrifying mixture of snake and large cat. Then the massive feathered wings on its back spread wide, and it launched itself from the tree and swooped down. It snatched Carl, digging its talons into his torso. The snallygaster flew back up into the canopy, out of sight, Carl's screams echoing through the forest. Thick droplets of blood rained down. Carl's screams suddenly choked off, and a second later, his head bounced down through the tree limbs and landed at Justin's feet. Justin raised his pistol and fired 3 quick shots up into the area where the snallygaster took Carl. At least one of the rounds must have hit the beast because it screamed in rage. Then it burst from the canopy and headed straight for Justin. Chris raised his shotgun, which was loaded with slugs, and fired off a shot. The slug tore through the snallygaster's left wing. A mass of bloody feathers fell to the ground. Though now injured and angry, the snallygaster continued toward Justin. Alyssa pushed him out of the way. The snallygaster landed where Justin would have been, roared in rage, and reached out with one of its foreclaws and snatched Alyssa by the arm. Jay put 3 rounds from his pistol into the beast's torso. It kept hold of Alyssa, but turned its attention to Jay. It opened its sharp beak, and 6 long, suckered tentacles shot from its mouth and wrapped around Jay's arm. Jay cried out in pain, but lifted his pistol and fired a round directly into the snallygaster's face. The bullet tore into the skin between its eyes, but ricocheted up into the air because of its incredibly thick skull. Chris snatched the machete from his belt, lifted it high, and brought it down across the tentacles, severing them. Thick crimson blood sprayed from the wounds onto Justin. The snallygaster roared in pain and let go of Alyssa's arm. It stepped back from the group, enough for Alyssa to take a shot with her rifle. She aimed and fired into the snallygaster's torso, where she hoped its heart was located. The bullet made a relatively small entry wound on the left side of its chest, but blew a large chunk of meat from its back. The snallygaster stumbled. It was severely injured, and the ground was slick with its blood. It spread its wings, ready to fly away, but Chris took the machete and stepped forward and hacked at its left wing, severing the joint. Justin stepped forward and plunged his Bigfoot spear into its stomach. Jay saw his chance and ran in and raked the wampus cat claw across the beast's neck, leaving deep, bloody gashes. The snallygaster stumbled back, bleeding from the ghastly wounds. It was losing strength, but it was still deadly dangerous. Chris and Alyssa ran out of ammo just as Justin and Jay each slammed a fresh magazine into their guns. They exchanged a knowing look, took aim, and they pulled their triggers a half-second apart. Justin's round slammed through the snallygaster's right eye, and Jay's round tore through its left eye. The bullets rattled around its thick skull, scrambling its brain. The snallygaster rose up in a final act of defiance, tried to scream in rage, but only let out a death rattle, and fell back onto the ground. Alyssa inspected her arm that the snallygaster had grabbed. It was badly bruised, but not broken. She looked at Justin and Jay and said, "Well, that was an impressive move." Chris stepped over to the snallygaster, raised the machete high, and brought it down on its neck, severing its head. He turned to the group and said, "I'm just making sure the damn thing is dead." They stood there for a moment, in silence, each of them thanking God that they had been victorious. Then Jay said, "You know what? Killing cryptids makes me hungry." Justin pulled his spear from the snallygaster's body. "I hear there's a place here that makes some pretty good waffles," he said. Chris laughed. "That would be Winona's Waffle Hut. And yeah, Winona makes one hell of a tasty waffle." Alyssa slung her rifle over her shoulder. "Help me get this monster back to my lab, and the waffles will be my treat." An hour and a half later, they sat at a booth at Winona's, eating eggs and waffles. "I'm impressed with how you two handled yourselves," Alyssa said. "So, if you had to sum up the whole concept of your podcast, what would it be?" Justin shoveled a forkful of eggs into his mouth and said, "Well, every episode we take a cryptid and discuss what we know about it and whether or not we think it's real. And with me being a biologist, I like to give people the facts." "Yeah, and I'm not tied so much to scientific facts," Jay said, "so I'll just tell you the truth." Alyssa smiled. She liked these guys with their tinfoil hats, spears, and wampus cat claws, and she hoped that she would see them again. "So, what is the truth?" she asked. "Well, that's easy," Justin said. "The world is far stranger than we think." "Well, I agree with that," Chris said. "If something is so weird that it's unbelievable, then it's probably the truth. And if you're not careful, that truth will sneak up on you and eat you."